Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I've been working as a mortician at Riverside Memorial Services for 19 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of tragedy that could walk through our doors: car accidents, sudden heart attacks, overdoses, suicides. Death comes in countless forms, and each one leaves its own particular mark on those left behind. But there's one case from last March that still keeps me awake at night, not because of how she died, but because of what happened after. Her name was Claire Whitmore, 26 years old, from a quiet suburb just outside of Portland. The medical examiner's report was straightforward enough: complications during an emergency cesarean section, internal bleeding that the surgical team couldn't control fast enough. What should have been the happiest day of her life became her last. The baby, a little girl they'd planned to name Ember, didn't make it either. Claire arrived at our facility on a Thursday evening in late March. The spring rain was coming down hard, drumming against the windows of the preparation room as I reviewed her case file. Her husband, Ethan, had called earlier that day. His voice was barely a whisper over the phone, broken in the way that only fresh grief can break a person. "Please," he'd said, "please make her beautiful. She was so excited about meeting our daughter. She bought this dress. She wanted to wear it home from the hospital." When I first saw Claire, I understood why Ethan had fallen in love with her. Even in death, there was something radiant about her features. High cheekbones, full lips that seemed to hold the ghost of a smile, and thick black hair that cascaded over her shoulders like dark water. Her skin had that porcelain quality that sometimes comes with significant blood loss, but there was still warmth in her features, as if she'd only just closed her eyes for a moment. The medical interventions had been extensive. Emergency surgery had left considerable trauma to her abdomen, requiring careful reconstruction before I could begin the embalming process. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the dreams she must have had during her pregnancy. The nursery they'd probably decorated, the clothes they'd bought, the names they'd debated over dinner. Ethan had brought the dress she'd wanted to wear home, a flowing yellow sundress with tiny white flowers embroidered along the neckline. It was still in its shopping bag with the tags attached, purchased months ago when their future still seemed certain. The receipt was still in the bag, dated from early December. She'd bought it during her second trimester, planning ahead for a spring homecoming that would never happen. I began the preparation process with extra care. There's something about maternal deaths that demands a different level of attention, a gentleness that goes beyond professional obligation. I found myself talking to her as I worked, something I rarely do with clients, not because I believe they can hear me, but because the silence felt too heavy for the enormity of what had been lost. "Your husband loves you very much," I told her as I worked on the reconstruction. "He's going to miss you terribly." The embalming process took longer than usual. The surgical trauma was extensive, and I wanted everything to be perfect for the viewing. Ethan had specifically requested an open casket service, despite the recommendations from the funeral director. He needed to see her one more time, needed to say goodbye properly. As evening turned to night, I moved on to the cosmetic work. Ethan had provided several photographs: Claire at their wedding, laughing at some joke he'd told; Claire at a family barbecue, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly; Claire in their nursery, assembling a crib with an expression of pure joy on her face. I studied each photo carefully, noting the way she held her head, the natural arch of her eyebrows, and the way her lips curved when she smiled. My job was to give Ethan one last glimpse of the woman he'd married, not just the body that remained. By midnight, I had finished the major reconstruction and moved on to the final cosmetic touches. I arranged her hair the way it appeared in the wedding photo, applied makeup to restore some color to her cheeks, and carefully positioned her hands. In the photographs, she often rested her right hand on her stomach, a protective gesture that seemed to come naturally to expectant mothers. The yellow dress fit perfectly, draping elegantly over her now flat abdomen. I arranged the fabric carefully, ensuring that the delicate embroidery was visible and that she looked as beautiful as Ethan remembered her. Finally, I stepped back to assess my work. Claire looked peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the preparation room had been replaced with softer lighting that gave her skin a warmer tone. Everything was ready for tomorrow's viewing. I covered her with a clean white sheet, made my final notes in the case file, and locked up the facility. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I finally drove home through the empty streets, the weight of the day's work settling in my chest like a stone. I returned the next morning at 7 a.m. to make final preparations before the family arrived. The viewing was scheduled for 10 a.m., and I wanted to ensure everything was perfect. Ethan would only get one chance to say goodbye to his wife and daughter. The preparation room was exactly as I'd left it. Quiet, orderly, dimly lit by the emergency lighting that stayed on throughout the night. I approached Claire's table and gently removed the sheet to check that everything remained as I'd arranged it. That's when I noticed the first anomaly. Her right hand, which I had carefully positioned at her side, was now resting on her abdomen, not just touching it, but cradling it in the same protective gesture I'd seen in the pregnancy photos. The fingers were slightly curved, as if she were holding something precious against her body. I stared at the hand for a long moment, trying to remember exactly how I'd positioned it the night before. I'm meticulous about documentation, and I always take photographs of the final positioning before covering a body. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos from the previous evening. There it was, clear photographic evidence that her hand had been at her side when I'd finished. Yet now it rested on her stomach in a gesture that was achingly familiar from the photos Ethan had provided. I checked the locks on the preparation room. Secure. The security system showed no unauthorized entries. No one else had access to the facility overnight, and even if they had, why would someone move just her hand into such a specific position? Bodies don't move after rigor mortis sets in, and Claire had been deceased for over 48 hours. But as I stood there studying her peaceful face, I noticed something else that made my skin prickle with unease. There were tear tracks on her cheeks, faint but unmistakable. Two thin lines that traced from the corners of her closed eyes down to her jawline, as if she had been crying. I touched one of the tracks gently with my fingertip. The skin was dry, but the evidence was clear. Post-mortem fluid leakage can occur, but not in this pattern. Not in a way that so precisely mimicked tears of grief. And I had checked her face carefully before covering her the night before. These tracks hadn't been there. I found myself backing away from the table, my heart hammering in my chest. In 19 years of mortuary work, I'd never experienced anything like this. Bodies don't move, bodies don't cry. There had to be a rational explanation. But as I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A sound was coming from somewhere else in the room. Soft, rhythmic, muffled. It took me a moment to identify it, and when I did, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was crying, the soft, desperate cry of a newborn baby. I spun around, scanning the preparation room frantically. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. But it was definitely there. The unmistakable mewing cry of an infant who needed comfort. The sound lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then faded into silence. I stood there in the sudden quiet, my hands shaking, wondering if I was losing my mind. The stress of the job, the lack of sleep, the emotional weight of Claire's case. Perhaps it was all finally catching up with me. I forced myself to take a deep breath and approach the table again. Claire lay exactly as before, her hand still resting protectively on her abdomen, the tear tracks still visible on her cheeks. I reached for a tissue to gently wipe away the evidence, but as my hand drew near her face, something incredible happened. Her lips moved, not much, just the slightest parting, as if she were about to speak. But it was enough to make me stumble backward, knocking over a small tray of instruments that clattered to the floor with a sound like breaking glass. I stared at her face, waiting for some other sign of movement, but she remained still. Just that one tiny motion, so brief I might have imagined it, but combined with everything else I'd witnessed, I knew I hadn't imagined anything. The baby's cry came again, louder this time, filled with an urgency that tugged at something deep in my chest. It was the cry of a child who needed her mother, who was lost and afraid, and calling out for the only person who could comfort her. Without thinking, I found myself speaking to Claire. "She's looking for you," I whispered. "Ember is looking for her mama." The moment I said the name, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the entire world had paused to listen. And in that silence, I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of a heartbeat, not Claire's, which had been still for days, but something smaller, faster, more fragile. I don't know how long I stood there, straining to hear something that shouldn't exist. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that quiet room, where the impossible was slowly becoming undeniable. Finally, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Ethan and his family had arrived for the viewing. I quickly straightened the room, replaced the fallen instruments, and checked Claire one more time. Her hand remained on her abdomen, but the tear tracks had somehow disappeared, leaving her face peaceful and serene. Whatever had happened in those early morning hours seemed to have passed, leaving behind only questions I couldn't answer. Ethan entered first, supported by an older woman whom I assumed was his mother. He approached Claire's casket slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled grief. When he saw her, he let out a soft sob and reached for her hand, the one that rested on her stomach. "She looks beautiful," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She looks like she's just sleeping." He stood there for several minutes, holding her hand and speaking to her in Spanish. I couldn't understand the words, but the love in his voice was universal. Finally, he leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I love you, mi amor," he said. "Take care of our Ember until I can see you both again." As he straightened up, his expression changed. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Do you hear that?" he asked, looking at me with wide eyes. I listened carefully, and there it was again, faint but unmistakable. The soft cooing of a contented baby, no longer crying but making the peaceful sounds of an infant who had found comfort in her mother's arms. Ethan's face transformed. The crushing grief didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, wonder, peace, perhaps even joy. "She has her," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Claire has our baby." The other family members gathered around the casket, and I stepped back to give them privacy. Over the next hour, as they said their goodbyes, the soft baby sounds continued intermittently. Not everyone seemed to hear them. The older relatives appeared unaware, but Ethan's younger sister crossed herself and whispered a quiet prayer. As the viewing concluded and the family prepared to leave, Ethan approached me. "Thank you," he said, gripping my hand tightly. "I don't know what you did, but thank you. I can feel that they're together now. I can feel that she's not alone." I didn't know what to say. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? Instead, I simply nodded and told him it had been an honor to care for Claire. After the family left, I returned to the preparation room one final time. Claire's body would be moved to the chapel for the funeral service the following day, but I wanted a few moments alone with her first. She lay peacefully in her yellow dress, her hand still resting on her stomach in that protective gesture. The tear tracks were gone, her face serene and beautiful. But as I stood there, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the fabric of her dress, just over her heart, was a small wet spot. Not large enough to be noticed during the viewing, but visible up close. I touched it gently. It was warm and slightly damp, like tears that had fallen moments before. But Claire's eyes were dry, and I was the only other person in the room. I covered her with the sheet one final time and whispered a goodbye I hoped she could somehow hear. As I turned to leave, the baby sounds came one last time, not crying now, but the soft, rhythmic breathing of a child who was finally at peace. Claire Whitmore was laid to rest the following afternoon in the Catholic cemetery just outside of town. Ethan chose a headstone with room for two names, Claire's and Ember's, with the same date for both their births and deaths. Underneath, he had inscribed a single line, "Together forever." I attended the funeral service, something I rarely do for clients. As the priest spoke about eternal love and divine reunion, I found myself thinking about what I'd witnessed in that quiet preparation room. The rational part of my mind still searched for explanations, settling sounds in the building, my own emotional projection, stress-induced hallucinations. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real, not supernatural in any ghostly sense, but real in a way that transcended my understanding of life and death. Claire had been a mother for only a few brief moments before losing her daughter, but somehow that bond had proven stronger than death itself. In the weeks that followed, I found myself researching similar cases online. Stories of mothers who had died in childbirth, accounts from morticians and funeral directors who had experienced unexplained phenomena. The stories were remarkably consistent. Sounds of crying babies in empty rooms, protective gestures from deceased mothers, signs that the maternal bond continued beyond the grave. Most of these accounts were dismissed as folklore or stress-related hallucinations. But having experienced it myself, I began to wonder if we'd been too quick to rationalize away something that science simply wasn't equipped to measure. 3 months after Claire's funeral, Ethan stopped by the funeral home. He looked better, still grieving, but no longer carrying that crushing weight of total despair. He brought a photo to show me, an ultrasound image of Ember that he'd kept in his wallet. "I wanted you to see her," he said. "I wanted you to know who you helped bring peace to." I studied the blurry black and white image, trying to make out features in the shadowy outline. Ember would have been beautiful, just like her mother. "I still hear them sometimes," Ethan said quietly. "At night, when I'm falling asleep, Claire is singing lullabies to Ember. It should make me sad, but it doesn't. It makes me feel like they're safe." After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the nature of love and loss. In my profession, I see grief in all its forms, the bitter anger of unexpected death, the relief that follows a long illness, the crushing guilt of those left behind. But Claire's case was different. It was grief transformed into something else, something that felt more like completion than ending. That night, I drove past the cemetery where Claire and Ember were buried. The headstone was barely visible in the darkness, but I could see fresh flowers, yellow roses that Ethan must have left earlier that day. As I sat there in my car, I thought I heard something carried on the night wind, singing, soft and sweet and infinitely tender, a lullaby sung by a mother to comfort her child. I've been a mortician for almost 20 years now. I've prepared bodies for families from every walk of life, witnessed grief in all its forms, and learned to find meaning in the work of helping people say goodbye. I understand the chemistry of preservation, the art of restoration, the delicate balance between honoring the dead and comforting the living. But Claire Whitmore taught me something else. She taught me that some connections transcend the boundaries we think exist between life and death, not as ghosts or spirits or any supernatural phenomenon, but as something simpler and more profound, the echo of love continuing to resonate long after everything else has gone silent. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of my work, I remember that sound, the soft cooing of a baby who had found her way to her mother's arms. And I'm reminded that my job isn't just about preparing bodies for burial. Sometimes it's about helping souls find their way home. Ethan remarried 2 years later to a kind woman named Rachel Monroe, who understood that she wasn't replacing Claire, but joining a family that would always carry her memory. They had a son, whom they named Owen, and every year on Ember's birthday, they visit the cemetery together to leave yellow roses and tell stories about the mother and sister they never met, but will never forget. I still think about Claire often, especially when I'm working on cases involving young mothers. I listen more carefully now and pay attention to things I might have dismissed before. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear things that remind me that love really is stronger than death. Not in any mystical sense, but in the simple, profound way that the bonds we form in life continue to shape us long after we're gone. The yellow dress Claire never got to wear home from the hospital was donated to a women's shelter, where it hopefully brought joy to someone else facing a new beginning. Ethan kept only one thing, a small bracelet Claire had been wearing when she died, with a single charm in the shape of a tiny baby shoe. For Ember, he told me, when he came to collect Claire's personal effects, so she'll always know her mama was thinking about her. In my filing cabinet, I keep Claire's case folder along with all the others. But hers is marked with a small, yellow sticky note, not for any official reason, but as a reminder of the day I learned that some mysteries don't need to be solved, only witnessed. Some would say I imagined everything that happened in that preparation room on that March morning. The rational part of my mind has offered countless explanations over the years. But in the quiet moments before dawn, when the world is still and the boundaries between day and night seem thinnest, I know what I experienced was real. Claire found her daughter, and in finding her, she taught me that love doesn't end when the heart stops beating. It simply changes form, becoming something that can bridge any distance, overcome any obstacle, and unite souls across whatever separates this world from the next. That's not science or religion or any philosophy I can name. It's simply the truth I witnessed in a quiet room where a mother's love proved stronger than death itself.